All right then, shall we proceed? Can everybody hear me? No? Yes. Okay, because if you said no, I wouldn't believe you anyway, because obviously you would have heard the question. So I think the way that we're going to structure this is I am formally known as the moderator, but I'm actually not going to moderate so much. We've asked Tom and Terry to start us off with some questions, some thoughts that they have as the professors who've been working with students at Watkins College of Art, really orienting them to both to the kind of philosophical and technical aspects of some of the paintings in the show. So I think they have some really great questions to start with. As we go, because we're all friends here, it really is fine for you to ask a question from the audience even before we segue into a Q&A period. As a reminder, we will be going to the galleries afterwards and walking through, and if you have other questions that you'd like to ask or things you want to talk about, we can do that in a very chatty way in the gallery. So any way you look at it, it should be very pleasant. So Terry and Tom?
I'm Tom. It's very nice to be here. And I suppose I would just start by asking a question that's come up in a number of different ways in our discussions with students as we walk through the exhibition. And it may touch on some of what Matthew Ritchie said a few minutes ago. But the show seems to be making something of an argument about painting having something special or specific to say about the conditions of disorientation in the contemporary world, technological, political, social. And I'm wondering if people have some specific thoughts about what painting brings to this conversation. Like, what is it about painting that tells us something, perhaps that, social practice or video or photography or other media might have to say about the world we're living through?
This came up in a conversation with students as well. It's like just extending that a little bit. We understand painting is distinct from other mediums and other processes. Is that distinction important, or useful?
It sounds like I probably ought to get the conversation started since I'm the one who decided it should be a painting show. And I mean, there are a lot of things to talk about. I mean, for one thing, there's a lot of really interesting and strong painting happening around the world, and painting has a history, of course, that dates to cave times, and so it's actually an inherent language, and all art is a language, and all language builds on previous languages, and so there is this sense of these artists participating in something that is accessible in some way to a larger audience because people expect paintings to be art. Now that's a really sort of mundane thing, a mundane way of looking at it. But I think the more critical thing, in Matthew's essay, he talks about the chameleon-like properties of paint. Paint can be a chair, paint can be an idea, paint can be an emotion, paint can be a puzzle, a conundrum. It can be just about anything. It can be made to look just about anything. Now I was really taken and sort of a little bit challenged by Peter Plagans, who wrote the review in the Wall Street Journal, and he started it off by saying this painting show is about painters who are trying to desperately keep up with the digital age, or kind of he kind of posited it as if these painters felt themselves to be in competition with the digital age. And I'm not sure that that's really an accurate reflection of it. I mean, digital art, kinetic art, performance art, all of these things have their own gifts. And they're all voices and they're all languages that can explore some of the same ideas. What paint does is it has a material presence. The materiality of it, that kind of record of building up of thought processes. I mean, when I talked about Ellen Gallagher, I talked about this idea of the slowness, the fact that you can look at 50 images on your computer in the same time it might take you to look at one corner of that painting, and the gift of that painter is that she makes you want to do it. And just that idea of stopping and looking and thinking about a painting not just as a surface, but as a buildup of decisions. a buildup of ideas, and the artist has stopped at a certain point where these ideas, there's a lot of ambiguity, there's a lot of openness to it, and the notion of openness, the open composition, Simon Morley talks about this in his catalog essay, the difference between an open composition and a closed composition. Think of a classic portrait, where the figure, the person being portrayed is right in the middle, and you look at that, and nothing makes you your eyes want to leave to the left or to the right or to above or to below. But most of the paintings in this exhibition are open compositions. They actually invite you and encourage you to think that what you're looking at is something that you're seeing through a window. It's extended infinitely in all directions. Painting can do that. But almost anything can do that. Almost any kind of work of art can do that. Every work of art has to have a boundary. The boundaries of paintings are its edges. The boundaries of just about everything are its edges. That's how you know you're looking at, when you look in this direction, you're looking at art, and when you're looking in this direction, you're looking at not art. So every work of art has that distinctive limitation. And how you work within that limitation. For painters, it's often allegorical or metaphorical. But if you're a sculptor, you still have edges. You still have the work of art and then what's outside of the work of art. When you think of the frame of a painting, it actually belongs, in my mind, to in the company of computer screens and movie screens and TV and windows and all of those square things that you know are not the only thing. But you know that what you're looking at within that square thing is really worth looking at. It really tells you something about what you're not seeing. So that was kind of my thought with this. And I think that also internationally there are so many artists who are finding ways to describe the indescribable through paint. And artists always try to describe the indescribable, but in ways that look like there are some continuous ideas. So we have an artist from Bangkok, an artist from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and there's some overlap. Yeah, they're each using this language. It becomes available to everybody. They're using this language to describe their own experience of social transformation and change. So I think the accessibility, the allegorical properties of painting, the malleability and chameleon-like properties of painting are the things that really drew me to the idea of making a painting show. But you notice that not everything in the show is a painting. There are 2 videos. There's a virtual reality piece. Gada Amer's works are made out of embroidery, and as a very direct response to the idea that painting in the tradition that she was trained in is viewed as a masculine endeavor. And so the question is, if you do a medium-specific show, should you challenge your own premises? And should you expand the definition of what the medium specificity is? Does a painting have to be made out of paint is really, I think, an interesting question. Or is there a language of painting that can be transcribed into other ways of making art?
So you used a phrase describing some of the conditions of the painting in the exhibition. It was similar to a phrase that Matthew Ritchie used in his presentation. And you said how we think about edges. Could you expand on that a little bit? Are we talking about formal constructs? Or are we talking about, I take it that's not the case, but if you could expand on that, I'd appreciate it.
Okay. That sounded like a Matthew question.
Is this on?
It could be a very easy question, right? I mean, the edges maybe are constructed differently in the show than you would see in a David painting. But.
Well, I think, so there's like 3 things that are related in that. I didn't read the review. Did you guys read this alleged character assassination painting that we're all desperately trying to keep up with digitality? That just seems ridiculous and ill-informed, although Peter's a very nice guy. But all forms of visual reproduction, so going back to your question, stem from, we think, right, the original neurological impulse to produce pattern, which starts with cave painting. And so in that sense, like digitality, painting in the sense we're talking about for the show is constrained to boards or canvases or chairs, they're all the children of this first impulse 8 to 10,000 years ago, or when it starts to be formalized into like language, then we see this distinction, and then it becomes formalized further into code, which ultimately ends up being digital media. But that all happens long after the first paintings are made. So this notion that we're all sort of engaged in some kind of desperate effort to, I think if anything, painting is doing the opposite, which is insisting on the kind of fundamental conditions of observation, and that is much more closely located in the idea of a scatter, or a prismatic spray, or a surface, or an embroidered, or the spills, or swipes, marks, diagrams. You talked about Deleuze talking about Bacon, who actually refers to his paintings as diagrams. And this kind of stitching backwards and forwards into the surface of meaning, that all comes from what I think one of the terms is something called a Gansfield effect, which is like if you're put in a darkened room, turn the lights off. This is a great experiment for everyone to do. After a while, you'll start to see patterns appearing on your eyes. Your own neurology will start to paint for you. I think that's where this impulse, what we could call painting, is like properly located. It's like the production of, and that's where this question of boundaries is like much more an internal, like we put edges around things because neurologically we're designed to put edges on things. So we can tell the difference between things that we're looking at. But there's a kind of deficit in that kind of thinking in that it wants to proliferate endlessly and put edges around everything, and then it starts to become the idea of edges sounds pretty cool. And then you end up with Kant and all of that kind of nonsense of the proper things that should be in pictures and things that shouldn't be in pictures. Like, is that a painting? Right? No one's probably thinking that's actually art. But if it was a digital artist, if you were like sitting here, you might be like, that's my art, dude. You just totally insulted my art. But the fact that there's a painting in the room next door makes us recognize that this is not the painting. This is like the secondary, sort of like a ghost of the painting. These are kind of more interesting questions, I think, about the nature of digitality and what constitutes that painterliness. And then we talk about movies, like having painterly qualities, or music can be very painterly. So I think that kind of idea of a sound scatter, and when you were talking about sound and vision swapping places, where the useful distinctions are not, to me, and I write about this in the essay, painting's relationship to a technology. Painting will use any technology. People have painted on every single surface. And people have used every possible substance to paint. And there is an edge to it, but only in this tradition. There's lots of traditions where this is not the edge. You think of like Japanese screens, or 1,000 scroll painting, or it just goes on and on and on. Cloisonné, like there's so many examples of things that are painted. So I would say it's kind of like that question is both kind of, from Peter, is kind of too broad and too narrow in its vision at the same time. I hope that also goes back to some of your earlier question about historical boundary. Because I think we have to think about painting as a human activity, not something that's specific to anyone, if we're going to use it in this big thing. And so, Mark, why didn't you do a show that included all forms of painting?
Actually, my next show will include all forms of art. It's going to be amazing. We'll need a much bigger building. Susan, can we get a bigger building? That would be great.
I guess I'll. The panelists can enter in too, because it may trigger some things that you were talking about as well. But I think what came up, or what's triggered, particularly in our class, is the idea that if an edge in a David painting is different than an edge in your painting, formally, but also conceptually, and if art is a language, in other words, it presupposes that it's a discursive practice, and that it is consequently framed within history, that it is a language, then languages tend to wear out. We no longer use alchemy as a means of investigating, except as a sort of a sideline, or we're going back and picking up something that was lost in the rejection of it. Maybe I should just read this. I've got this quote from Nietzsche, and he says, "We need history, but not the way a spoiled loafer in the garden of knowledge needs it." In other words, if art is discursive and it is a language, a spoiled loafer in the garden of knowledge can use history inappropriately, like we're seeing in politics right now, I think. And so we need history, but not in the way a spoiled loafer in the garden of knowledge needs it. And so if art is a discursive practice in conversation with urgent issues impacting how we think and live within history, what pictures or models of history are being resisted, like alchemy maybe, and consequently which ones are being embraced or adopted to replace it. One of the articles used the word "a field of infinite substitutions," right? So if painting then is this discursive practice, and it's jettisoning those failed languages that are no longer support the polis, and I think that's how art is political. And you talked about politics too. Politics is the polis, the people, the police, the polite. All those words, and at some point those things become worn out and not useful and not supportive. They fail to live up to the promise of politics. And so conditions within painting and within art get rejected and other things embraced. And while I guess I'm on the show is centered around a lot of 18th and 19th century ideas of romanticism and the sublime and the material of paint. So how is that then substituted? I mean, how is that changed or affected? Are there things that need to be rejected from those kind of notions and things that become embraced instead? So, long question. maybe Tom can clarify that question.
I mean, one question we could maybe paraphrase Terry's statement would be, why the sublime now? What does the sublime say to us in the contemporary world, and how does this language, which was embodied in Turner and Jericho and these eminent figures in the 19th century, like, what does this say to the contemporary world? Like, why the sublime at this point in time, I guess, would be a way of paraphrasing.
Thank you. Anybody?
Hello. Sublime. I mean, I think being overwhelmed, being overwhelmed and sort of trying to make sense out of all the things that are happening, I feel like sublime is a good word for it. I feel like more than ever, there's like so many voices now. There's no dominant voice. So like, there's multiple voices, and you're just trying to get your head around all these voices, and you end up with no real solution at the end. So you're just kind of left with these multiple directions and multiple thoughts, which is actually, it's not a bad thing. Because then one could make their own decisions about those directions. And I think, I don't know, personally for me, like making a painting is always trying to sort of make sense out of those multiple things that are overwhelming me and just kind of freezing them in one place and hoping that the audience could also like look at these multiple like worlds within worlds and sort of maybe bring their own bring their own experiences into it, and maybe somehow they'll activate it, they'll activate the painting that way, and then maybe there's some kind of a dialogue, and going back to your question about painting, I think it's like painting is, when you compare it to like the other mediums out there, I mean, to me, it's like a very primal thing, it's been done since, cave days. It's funny, like my my daughter, when she was like 1.5, I brought her to my studio and gave her some brush and paint, and she just started painting. Like, I didn't show her anything. And it was good too. So it's like, it's within you somehow, you know, where I think other mediums, there's a level of like learning that you have to do in order to be able to even use. I mean, with painting you have to do a lot of learning too, but I think, I don't know, with photography or with installation or with video or whatever, there's like a level of, it's very technical, right? Like the execution, the end result might come out as fluid and sublime, but I think the actual doing, like making it, is very technical, where even in painting it could be technical too, but there's also this level of like, I don't know, like it's very animalistic maybe, you know, like it's very primal, and I feel like you're tapping into something else, maybe the unknown or whatever, in order to be able to create, where I'm not sure if any other medium could do that.
I have a very different experience about painting, actually, because I have never seen any painting when I grew up. So when I came to France, in Nice, my father wanted to take us to see the churches and to see the paintings. And I found them extremely ugly. Really, I thought, I was very shocked. And I was like, why are they in this frame? And why are they dark? So for me, I don't take painting for granted at all. It's just something that has always been foreign to me. So it's just because you speak about painting as if it's like something normal, but some people has never seen a painting. I'm one of them. I haven't, and I have a friend in Saudi Arabia. We're talking because it's forbidden. The painting is forbidden in Saudi Arabia as well until like even right now. And he was telling me that he had an Egyptian art like professor, and he would show him all of the Van Gogh and all of these painting, but in a black and white reproduction. And he thought that these paintings were black and white until he was 20 and he went to London, and so I was like, oh my God, these paintings are in color. So I do not agree with you that it's like normal.
I actually have the same experience. I did a BFA in studio art in Iran, and I always thought that Clay's kiss was completely abstract. The kiss was cut off. And then I found out there was a real kiss in the kiss. And I was thrilled. I mean, for me, it was the opposite. I was like, this is amazing. There's a kiss in there.
Again, I think the persistence of language. I mean, you know, the idea that the language of painting has been going on a long time, and to say that, you know, that the show evokes notions from the 18th and 19th century doesn't mean that those notions were actually invented in the 18th and 19th century. I mean, the idea of the sublime, of course, goes all the way back to ancient Rome and Longinus, and he's talking about the sublime as this elevated state of mind, and Burke talks about it in another way, and Kant talks about it in another way, and other people talk about it in another way. But I think the thing that struck me is not that we're not really talking about the sublime feeling that you get when you're confronted with a tornado. I mean, but I think people still feel that. Like if you're confronted with these powerful forces of nature, I mean, then there can oftentimes be a feeling of awe and a feeling of terror, and this is what Burke talks about. But I think the perspective of this show is that we can feel the same way when we are confronted with the powerful forces of the human-made world that seem also inexplicable in many ways. You know, so if you think about the internet, and so much of the work in the exhibition is really related to technology, and so much of the work is related to history. These are human enterprises that are vast and that are deep, that don't reveal themselves, that have an impact on our lives that we oftentimes don't know, but we feel that it's happening. And so that sense of mystery at these unknown forces is really what this is after. So it's not a 19th century painting show. It's a show that uses some of the language that artists worked with in the 19th century, but it also uses language that artists worked with in the mid-20th century. And I think, you know, when I think about times of crisis, you know, think about Dadaism in response to World War I, or abstract expressionism in response to World War II. Those are all about fracturing. Those are all about a disassociation between what one has always thought to be a constant in the world, all of a sudden shattered by these variables. And I think that's part of the premise of the show, is that we may be feeling some of the same things. So there are different languages for different mediums that one can choose to use, but it's not a show that is, I mean, from my perspective, it's not embedded in a 19th century idea of the sublime.
Oh, and I have one more. Yeah, on that point, I think thinking about the Jay-Z and Beyonce, sort of occupation of the language of the Louvre, which was kind of declared a public museum by Napoleon as a revolutionary gesture, having previously been a royal palace. And one of the things that painting has that's really strange is it doesn't operate in the same time frame so kind of linking it specifically to the critical language of its day. So you see something like a Caspar David Friedrich painting, which is allegedly of the sublime. It's a little guy in a top hat looking at a glacier. And if you go to these places, they're actually not even that impressive. People used to go to the north of England and stand on. You go up there, the mountain's like 30 feet tall, and there's like a painting of someone standing there looking like, my God! And you're like, wait, this is okay. They were using the language of the preceding era, whereas at the same time, someone like Turner is trying to describe like Michael Faraday's force drawings. So he was friends with Faraday, and they were very aware they were drawing invisible forces. But that picture language doesn't show up properly until the early 20th century. It takes painting a long time to sort of properly digest. So artists in the 19th century were often painting ideas that were being talked about, but they were still using the picture language of the previous century, which is the kind of edges and mountains and people in top hats and robes and capes and all that stuff. And they were just trying to get to it, but they hadn't, it's a very slow, and so this idea that it's sort of tracking contemporary technologies decade by decade, which is often the art historian sort of approach. Not to diss you guys, but it's like they're like, well, so-and-so didn't read that article. There's that amazing book by Linda Henderson about how people thought Cubism was to do with relativity, but the theories weren't actually published in a language that could have been read by any of the Cubists until long after they painted those pictures. They were actually painting Poincaré's theory of space-time, four-dimensional space-time, from the 30 years before. But it looked like, for a long time, people thought, oh, these must be the same things because they were painted at the same time. And I think that's a kind of idea that whatever we're doing in this show is somehow timely because we're painting these pictures now. Most likely, we're like talking to people in the 16th century and hopefully the future, and like you said, from countries where they never saw this work. We're all kind of like engaged in our own conversations across space and time. And it's probably a false criticism of the show, but maybe a useful one to sort of imagine that it's therefore, because it's this year, it's somehow a coherent body of unified voice, artists all marching in our artist army, saying we made these paintings for the 21st century and here they are all at once, It's much more this kind of scatter of impressions and moments, and like you were talking about all those weird guys who show up, and the robots and the priests and the sorcerers. And you were talking about things happening in the studio being embroidered and stitched through, and a garden you're thinking about a garden. But we make paintings out of all these things, right? And then this thing happens that is the painting, and I'm sure was just as true. So it's at our peril. Similarly in politics, when we go back and say, well, in the 1900s, Dred Scott, blah blah blah. Why hasn't it all gone exactly the way we had? It's not a set of dominoes all lined up. History doesn't work like that. So.
I just had one more thought, and I feel like having a conversation about a show like this, the first question we're trying to air is, why painting, in the sense that didn't they say painting was dead? And so you get involved in a conversation with painters who are like, oh, we're not dead, and the painting isn't dead. And I think that that's actually the conversation to have, all the reasons why that doesn't work. But I actually think there should also be a little channel to take that, play devil's advocate and be like, yes, a painting in a gallery, in a museum, will never have the impact of a Hollywood blockbuster movie or a presidential tweet, let alone like a piece of video art. And I think the value of that is actually in the risk. That this is an artist taking a risk on a form of address that isn't necessarily going to change the world. But maybe it can change something, or maybe it can have some value, and that's why we need spaces like this. We need spaces like this to be able to take those risks. So I think we should just see that side channel of bracketing the idea of relevance for a second to open up a space to experiment with something that, sure, might not be something that you can justify, like, yes, this is why painting matters. Let's also play with the idea that it is not our dominant mode of address, visually or otherwise, today. And that's actually maybe a good thing.
For the record, nobody said painting was dead.
Yes, my teacher. Yes, they said it. Like, in France, yes, I was. No, for everybody, and then only if you want to do painting, it's men. But painting was dead, and I was very sad about this. And I had a teacher actually talking about the sublime, because this was the first, and the whole my study was a teacher of aesthetics who he taught us le beau, the beauty, of Kant, and it was very important for him that we understand the notion of beauty, not decoration or what does it mean. And he was fighting very much in school against the notion of the death of painting. It was not art. The death of painting in France was very, in the 80s, was and then he's the one who really, all the time, for me, I'm very sensitive to the sense of beauty. For me, I like that, and I want my painting to be beautiful, because this is the only way I can touch people. So.
I'm a painter too, so I don't think painting's dead, but I do think there are certain conditions of painting that are dying. That's what I'm talking about, right? And there are certain conditions of the idea of the sublime that are dying and being replaced by other conditions of the sublime. And so that's what we're talking about. If I'm going in the studio as a painter, what things do I have to leave behind? Because they're reifying conditions. In other words, they're calcifying. They're kind of a nostalgia or romanticism about a thing. In some ways, I have to leave behind. And if I still believe in the sublime or that which is mysterious, how do I get to it without being burdened by, the reifying condition of paint, certain conditions of painting, not painting completely painting, but those conditions of painting that are no. And if you're dealing with students, right, you deal with that. You say, well, you really can't be doing that abstract expressionist painting unless somehow you do something else with it. Like your paintings, for instance, were seen by our students as in a continuum with Pollock and color field painting and landscape. They were seeing all these conditions in there, but they weren't exclusively that. Something happened to shock them or wake them up or to realize that something's been added or taken away from that condition of painting that could very easily be reifying or objectifying. And so there are conditions in history. There are ideas of history. History as a linear, progressive thing is a condition of history that probably is no longer tenable. But the idea of history is still tenable, and the idea of painting is still tenable as well. So I'm looking for those things that you add to or take away from the practice of painting that keeps it alive. It's a still animating thing. You mentioned the word aesthetic. It means to breathe in. It's still animated. It's not dead or reified. I think I'm preaching again, but one of the first shocking things that happened to me in college is to see Dubuffet shift from a primitive relationship to painting to those paintings he calls hour loops. They were, but he recognized in his practice, I'm assuming, that he could no longer be a primitive. He wasn't a primitive. He couldn't be a primitive. He had to shift his practice to make it engaging. And in class last week, we compared a de Kooning mark to a Jasper Johns or a Rauschenberger or a Kippenberger mark. Exactly the same mark, but totally different as a semiotic sign, right? I mean, they were read different within paint and within history. So I guess, I don't know that there's a question in there, except what is dying about the idea of the sublime, the idea of romanticism, the idea of painting, what should be resisted in those kinds of things, and what things can we do to, again, getting back to this idea of the infinite substitution, what is being substituted for the reifying or dying condition of those things. And
one of the great things about living today is that the notion of historical inevitability, I think, has gone down the drain. Things don't have to be the way things are sort of imagined. You talked about this, Matthew, this idea that we can predict 10 days into the future. And of course, the whole premise of a lot of theorists of modern art is that there's this kind of this progression, and so we've left romanticism behind. We've left the ideas of the sublime behind. We've left those things behind. We don't need them anymore. But the truth of the matter is, at least from my perspective, is if you look at what romanticism stood for, what it means, I think that a lot of the things, the tenets of romanticism have been so deeply sort of absorbed into our cultural psyches that we don't even think about them or recognize them anymore. The idea that emotions are as important as the intellect, the idea of the importance of sensuality and sexual freedom and all of these things, those are ideas that were put forth by the Romantics. We don't call them romantic ideas anymore. We just call them normal. And so I think that this notion that we leave things behind as we move forward, every artist is challenged. And I used to be an artist, and I was challenged, and I kind of just gave up. Every artist is challenged to create a language for himself or herself that is as true as possible, that is cognizant of other languages, all the other ways artists have used, as many ways as possible that artists have used language, and your challenge and your charge is to make a language that is so distinctive and communicates something that is worth communicating. I've often said that I see 10,000 works of art a year, and many of them are paintings, many of them are not paintings, and of that 10,000, maybe like 0.1% is something that really hits me as the artist has actually come to this language that actually means something, that actually tells me something about myself in relationship to the world and in relationship to other people and other people's relationships to the world. And to me, art is a communication. And however that communication is affected, if it hits you hard, if it hits you in the mind and the heart at the same time, and maybe even in the stomach, because we're art people and we love food, but then it's something that's worth paying attention to because it's actually quite rare.
I just thought about something when you were talking about, like certain things dying out. I don't know, it kind of made me think about like notion of like thinking about the idea of progress in a linear way, and I tend to disagree with that one-directional kind of way. Like I see it more like as a spiral as opposed to linear, and I think when you think about things in a spiral, then things that maybe made sense for a certain period of time in history, and then they don't make sense anymore, but then when you come back around, maybe they make sense again, and so on throughout history. So if I don't know, if you think about it that way, then this notion of something dying, maybe like death and then rebirth, death, rebirth, like after death, it's not just death and then that's it. Like I think there's like a rebirth as well. so, I mean, that goes for anything like painting or belief systems or whatever. Like they come back again, but with a different name, and then they die out maybe, and then they come back again. So, I don't know.
Yeah, that's basically, I mean, I think I get some of your question, which is like, what has to be left behind in the moment?
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Right? And something always in the moment that you're making work is left behind. And if you're just sort of wallowing in nostalgia from 1946 and you're a young, 22-year-old art student and you're just listening to Coltrane and making like little Mark Tobey paintings, and wearing kind of vintage clothes, that's a fantasy that you're living. But if you made a little movie about yourself doing that, it would probably be quite an interesting little weird contemporary art project. But you lack the critical self-distance to see that certain types of things are, like you were just saying, located in a certain moment, like Support Surface and all those white French male painters who weren't, when painting was dead, then they made those horrible but kind of brilliant, weird paintings that aren't paintings but are.
No, they're painting only for men.
Yeah, exactly. Only men could make these paintings that were not paintings because painting was dead. And then in the 80s, like David Salle was like super famous for saying painting is dead. That was his whole career. He had killed painting. And then there were all these other people who were like, well, what am I going to paint? And when I started in New York in the 90s, you could only make paintings with quotation marks around them. And I was in a lot of shows that were paintings. And we all knew that we had to just kind of move everything about 4 inches to the left and leave a little bit of extra open space to show that we knew that it wasn't a painting, it was a painting. And then we would just paint away. Like people like John Kern would just paint the hell out of the rest of that painting. But they were painting, and then it became painting forever. There were a whole bunch of shows like Project Painting, Painting Forever. And then suddenly, by about 2003, everyone was just painting again. Like the whole quotation mark thing had just totally dissolved. And now we're all just painting again. But I'm sure it will die, and then we'll have to make some paintings very carefully to bring it back to life. It's like with a sort of working with a patient. But each time, we did really have to kind of, I think it's about creating a kind of shift in perspective on the practice. And there are distancing mechanisms. Just as there were in the 1970s, you start making paintings out of blocks of wood or stripes or something, like Daniel Buren, you pretend you're not painting, but you're painting away, but you've just got this new, but a lot of that is a language shift and a sort of stepping, it's about the position of the painter to the technology and framing of the time. Like Wade Guyton does not paint at all. He sits in a room with a whole bunch of people on computers, but he's definitely making paintings, right? He's just understood this is the toolkit for him. Warhol, we don't really say Warhols aren't paintings anymore, right? No one has that conversation. That'd be exhausting. But they're silkscreen prints,
Or Weochole yarn paintings, for instance, like you're making paintings out of fabric that's been done, the Weochole yarn painting. Those are really good points. I mean, to me, I'm hearing there doesn't have to be quite the satirical, ironic relationship to painting that was necessary 30 or 40 years ago. And that's one of the things I think younger artists are going, is I really have to have that strident, conceptual, and ironic relationship. But on the other side of that coin is, you can embrace a degree of sincerity to such a degree that it doesn't enter into what you just mentioned, a critical relationship with a piece. So somewhere in between there, this kind of playfulness that happens there, I think, is what I'm seeing in the show, is resistance to some of the codifying conditions of previous painting, and even a resistance to the codifying conditions. So in your paintings, for instance, you see the introduction of personal imagery, of allegory, of these contaminated conditions that are sort of addressing what used to be thought of as paintings that were things in themselves. Jackson Pollock painting or Colorfield painting were paintings that were things in themselves, and now they're paintings that are things in themselves plus things beside themselves, contextual issue, which I think is a phrase you use. David Joslet term, painting beside themselves, a hysterical condition that comes in, a narrative condition that comes in, an allegorical condition that comes in, a degree of sincerity that comes in, and all those become contaminating conditions to a more rigid, codified sense of what painting and the exhaustion of painting was.
So I just had a thought coming at it maybe from just a human perspective, and also as someone who kind of moves between the studio space, especially with younger artists just starting out, but also, I write for art magazines, art criticism, trying to put things in a historical perspective in capital letters. Those are actually different spaces, right? And what a museum exhibition, like, the painting show at the MoMA, for example, which I think was not even near as informed as the show here was doing, is arbitrary. There isn't actually a direct line from you channeling the right kind of relevance in your studio as a student, and therefore that is like the end point of your trajectory at all. There's politics there, there's institutional hierarchies there, there's misinformation and not understanding, and politics of dealing with like what a very market-driven situation can sustain in these urban centers. Whereas I think what happens in a studio is just, like, you have to be honest. Like, where are you coming from? And what is your work about? And can you be as informed about it as you possibly can? Like, that's just the work. I don't know that the work is like, how do I maneuver myself into this chess game that is so arbitrary in the first place? So I just sometimes want to sort of point out the distance, that these aren't a seamless continuum of an artwork world that you can get wrong because someone has done it and you're out of your time. There is a path towards being like really honest with who you are as an artist, but don't believe Art Forum.
I see where you're coming from in that regard, but I also say that, like, you don't get to decide whether you play chess as soon as you pick up the canvas and you step into a whole series of conventions that are, in some sense, historically overdetermined, right? And so every decision you make is, in some sense, a response to everything that's happened within that frame, within that space.
Well, it's also a response to everything that's happening now outside of that space. Like, it's predetermined socially, by class, by ethnicity, by, all of the things that you represent outside of what your practice might be about, even in its best case scenario. So it's both. I guess all I'm saying is let's just keep this other end of the picture also while, thinking about intellectually and artistically how it might work. Yeah.
And that actually may allow for a bit of a transition, if that was okay, Terry?
Sure.
All of you, several of you, and throughout the catalog, there's a characterization of a lot of the work that suggests that it does more than simply respond to, but it also kind of answers what's happening in the contemporary world. Like, you talk about cosmopolitanism. Simon Morley discusses the way in which, the experience of the sublime might fracture our kind of ego tunnel or our kind of narrow self-interests. You speak of an ethics of seeing towards the end of your essay. So I wonder if any of you have any comments on the way in which the work in this show or the work that you discuss in your essays responds to the contemporary world, or does more than respond to it, even answer it, or provide a kind of distinct worldview that contradicts a lot of the forces that are addressed within the framework of the show. It's a necessarily challenging question, but I mean, you speak of the fracturing of an ego tunnel as in some sense an opening for kind of other political possibilities.
Yeah, and that's not specific to painting.
Yeah.
But I think it is specific to cultural expressions in general, whether it's a musical work that you hear that makes you sort of open up momentarily to a whole new world of possibilities. When we talk about the ego tunnel, Thomas Metzinger, the neuropsychologist, talks about the fact that we all have to kind of construct the walls around our experience so we can focus on the things that are important. I mean, that's the way we succeed in life. And the most easy way of understanding the ego tunnel is to think about the computer screen. You focus on that, everything else just sort of disappears. And that's important, but what happens when you believe that the ego tunnel is actually real? Then it prevents you from being distracted by things that actually may be really important for you to be distracted by. And it could be a hungry lion sneaking up behind you. But it also could be some great sort of revelatory piece of information that your worldview won't allow you to even acknowledge. And I think that that's what art in general does, whether it's art functioning within a pictorial frame as a painting does, or whether it's a Yayoi Kusama infinity room that you go into and all of a sudden. But it's also something that people find this in different ways. They find it in drugs and alcohol. You know, they find this idea of the temporary lifting of the ego tunnel. It always finds its way back. But I think that that's kind of what I think is interesting about an exhibition of works that are essentially open compositions that all imply that they're artificial, that there's an artifice there, and that what you see in front of you is only a snippet of this larger frame out there. You know, when you think about Guillermo Cuitca's map, you know, it's like, you know that's, you know, if this could continue infinitely. When you think about Gada Amer's embroidered paintings, you think, well, you know, this could actually be 75 feet tall and 100 feet long, and it would just be sort of amazing. It could go on forever. And that idea of infinity, I think, is something that is suggested by what is the stone in Mecca, the Kaaba? Yeah. Is it? Yeah. This idea that the Kaaba faces a black stone that faces equally up, left, west, east, north, south, and down. So it's facing everywhere, and so it's reflecting the magnitude of the universe. And I think in some ways, geometry and rectangles in particular have been historically thought of as fulfilling that function. And so I think that historical view of why paintings are always square or rectangular has something to do with that. Does that answer that doesn't even begin to answer your question. I'm sorry.
You want to go? You don't want to touch this one?
Well, you speak at the end of your lecture about turning ourselves inside out, and there's a sense of that as something that would be a kind of opening or would be inclusive or something of that sort. So I'm just curious as to.
Well, yeah, and speaking, I know there's a lot of students here, so speaking specifically to that question of what Mark's calling the ego tunnel, and we can trace technology in painting, a technological series of very discrete changes also to what is kept and what is left behind, where the introduction of the idea of hidden forces, force relations, becomes incorporated into 19th century and 20th century process very gradually, starting with Turner's relationship with Faraday and the idea that invisible forces are no longer the sole premise of God, but now, and angels, but now they're like real physical forces, they're affecting the world, and slowly they become the kind of substrate for a kind of mark making. And this mark making, you can see it in Georgiana Houghton and the spiritualists of the late 19th century, and then it gradually becomes the kind of, all of whom know artists and are working with artists, like Duchamp and his whole crew are all theosophists, so are the suprematists, so are the whole gang. So they're all thinking about invisible force relations, and there's this effort by art and artists, really ambitious effort, to incorporate the invisible language of the universe, which is the language of physics at the time, into art itself, and claim for art this total authentic relationship with the drawing of the universe. This is what Kandinsky and the foundations of what we think of as 20th century art, and certainly this show, are embedded in this very, it's a very documented historical transition. We tend to shy away from it because it sounds like magic and tarot reading, and yes, it was all of that stuff. But they were all at it, Mondrian, everyone, they were all theosophists, thinking about this kind of as a very ambitious move. If you accept that art historical transition, then you're accepting that artists sort of thought we could pull it off. We could have the visual language of the invisible force relationships of the universe done. And art would talk about high art, it would become the ultimate. And artists of the time write about art as the ultimate form of human expression. And it kind of elevates itself. And a lot of contemporary museum culture and going and thinking about art is still driven by this fantasy. And then it kind of trickles its way down into an art student's studio who gets this kind of residue left over that, like, if I sort of scribble a bit to the left and kind of shake it around a bit, I'm doing something very important that's like a direct translation of me to the universe. And it's not untrue, and it's not that that history didn't happen. It's that that history is the articulation of an incredibly complex and detailed language, in many ways richer and more Baroque than the language of science over that period. And the language of science over that period is 200 years of the most difficult science ever done. So the idea that you would just sort of be able to walk into your studio and just kind of turn it on, man, whether I'll just smoke a little weed and just check right into the universe, is crazy, right? Like that's the ego tunnel, is like that there's a shortcut, right, through art, that you just show up and that somehow you're getting to the sublime through this stuff and you just kind of mix it up. But in fact, what we really do is we go and spend thousands of hours worrying over some wretched little corner of the painting, you know, or working with our difficult collaborator who claims they're not our collaborator and then is our collaborator again and then isn't next week, and just to kind of make some stuff over a lifetime of kind of like, and that's it. That's our experiment. It's like this tiny little, at the end of it all, if you're lucky, you've achieved like this one little realm of the cosmos that's really just your own kind of projected sort of fantasy of that conversation. But the only way is to be honest about that. Like the only way to achieve any kind of like forward motion in that, I think, and to be honest historically, is about that tradition, what it tried to achieve, what it failed to achieve. It completely failed at that time. You look at a Kandinsky now, you're like, what? The blue circle is what again? You know, it's like my diagrams. You're like, the page, oh, the blue circle is, wait, but it's sad here, but it kind of looks happy. Is it music? Wait, he's saying it's music on page 368, and his writings are like this. I'm getting up there, you know, but I've got a long way to go. So I think that conversation about them locating that in but inside that, I think there's another conversation about being cosmopolitan, and the reason that entering the cosmopolis, is that a word? It's like the universal city, like the city of the universe, the cosmopolis, right? It's like a city that is the universe, that you are a citizen of that as of right as soon as you choose to be an artist. You're sort of saying, on the one hand, yeah, I can pull this off, but on the other hand, you're asserting a continuity with all things. That's the outrageous claim of 20th century art, is that you can, by simply showing up in the studio and making something amazing and weird, be that citizen. And it's open wherever you are. And that's where a painting scores over high technology, high effect, socially legislated products, is that really anyone can do it. Your grandma can do it. You can, and that's where it's a kind of weirdly democratic practice, because it has this accessibility is built into it. It's also its fatal flaw, is because everyone believes they can be an artist. Frank Sinatra thinks he's an artist. Jim Carrey thinks he's an artist, you know. We don't really talk about all that work, but we kind of should when we talk about painting, because that's part of painting too, is this idea that it's practiced at all kinds of different levels by all kinds of different people who aren't trying to connect to the sublime, but maybe have that feeling too. Anyway, I think that's sort of where this kind of the cosmopolitan nature of it is a kind of weirdly generous thing about painting specifically, because you don't need a team of 80 people. You can be an artist in Bhutan, and you can be a painter, right? You
can be George Bush, be a painter.
You can even be George Bush.
I think we've all warmed to those paintings in the past year.
Well, I think actually we're just about out of time for our panel. Megan, do we have time for any questions? Okay, so if anybody does have a thought or a question, please.
I want to hear you come back on the cosmopolitan.
Let's do that over beer at the Flying Saucer. Yes, there is a question back there.
Okay, so you said that coming into the art community, we've kind of stumbled upon research that's been done on what is sublime, what is part of the universe, where we fall into this kind of category. My question would be, what are the steps we need to take to get to the sublime, to become part of this conversation? What do we need to kind of check at the door, leave behind? What, as new, young artists, do we need to bring to the table to be part of this conversation?
I don't know who that was addressed to, but I'll try it. As a young artist, your responsibility is not necessarily to worry about the sublime. Your responsibility, you can, but your responsibility is to figure out, well, what is important? What is important to you, but also, what is your relationship to the culture? What is your relationship to the world? And there are a lot of people who feel like the person Matthew described, you go into the studio and you scribble something, and because Cy Twombly did it 50 years ago, you're all of a sudden as important as Cy Twombly. No, but for me, the sublime is, very literally a slippery thing, and the notion of mystery, the notion of the ungraspable. This is what is talked about a lot in the subject, in discussion of the sublime. What is it that is not really, what is the appropriate thing for art to take on because other things can't take it on? Language can't, words can't take it on. And I would defy anybody here to give me words that will be the equivalent, the aesthetic equivalent of Gada Amer's painting, of Ali Banisadr's painting. They're actually articulating something that is inarticulable in any other way. That's what I think. And so in some ways that makes any work of art that tackles this, that tackles mystery in an honest way. Ambiguity, I think, is a condition of our times. Then I think that there is something of the sublime in all of that. It doesn't mean it's the high sublime. It's not like Turner necessarily or Rothko. But again, I wouldn't worry about it. I would worry about, well, what can you articulate that hasn't been articulated, and what language do I use to articulate it, not just for my own pleasure, but because I think it's really important for this to enter the discourse, enter the cultural discourse.
Yeah, I teach freshman art, and I'm just dovetailing on what Tom was saying is like, you have to learn the grammar of whatever it is you're working in. So, yeah, and if you're a painter, you have to learn the grammar of painting. You have to learn how paint feels and how brushes work and how surface receive paints, and you can't skip over that hard work of that grammar. If it's a video photography, you have to learn the grammar of that. But the other thing that Mark was suggesting, it's also a discursive practice. In other words, it enters into a conversation with a community, and that's the idea of the cosmopolitan again. But the community can be very small. Wherever 2 or 3 are gathered, it doesn't have to be the whole world. But it does have to be in a conversation with a group of people that are engaged. It does have to be in conversation with a history that it finds itself in, and it has to be involved in the grammar of whatever tools or mediums and processes you're working with. And when you skip over any of those things, you have, I think, a failed project. So.
Any other questions? Oh, over here.
So my question is for Gada. I'm really interested in your approach to painting as both something traditional with paint and brushes, but also something that is made with nature. And I'd like to know more about the vocabulary you use with nature, and also how you feel about your work being ephemeral in that way. I think with paintings, we often think of it being something that'll last centuries and will be preserved and conserved over time, but with something like a garden, it takes tending, and as you mentioned, only one of them still exists.
Well, first, I would like that my garden, they are not ephemeral, but nobody bought them, so they are ephemeral. But sorry, only one of the gardens have been in an estate, so they are very good in taking care of them. But any of my garden can be permanent. So, but it's a very more difficult permanent. It's not like a museum. I made the painting, it's inside the museum. You just have to have climate control, and that's it. It's something that you have to go and tend, and like the plant dies, and you have to put them again. I don't know. My idea, when I started to do garden, was that I didn't like to have an object, like, like those huge sculpture in the middle of a space, and then people would look at it, because outside, I'm talking about the outdoor sculpture, that now I do some, but I have always had a problem with these giant things, because I thought that the tree is much more beautiful than this thing. I don't know, this is how I started to develop these gardens as art installation, in a way. I don't know if I answered your question.
Hi, so I have a specific question and then kind of like a question for all of you. My first is for Ali. So as you mentioned, your pieces have stories within stories, so I was curious to know if you ever concentrated on one subject and like expanded on their own personal story, or maybe like entered a series on one specific subject.
Well, I don't think so. No, I think because the way I see them is, I see them as very encyclopedic, and every day that I come into the studio, you have different things on your mind that you want it to somehow work its way into the painting. And also, like, I feel like I always say that, like, the paintings are never about a certain time or a certain place, is because I want, like, say, a figure in a painting to in my mind, it represents multiple things at one time. And I mean, it's like a challenge to do that, but like I'm most satisfied when it could have multiple meanings for me at once. It could have maybe a dominant story within the painting, but as your eyes moves around and looks at a part of the painting, like I want it to sort of go into like other time and place, and I think, I mean, like, for example, novels that I like I never like to read something that takes place in a certain time and certain place. I feel like it feels like trapped to me, and so like I like books that they go in and out of time and sort of compare different cultures, compare different ideas, and in that way I feel most fulfilled. So I feel like the paintings also end up kind of like mimicking that.
Thank you. The second question is, I found it interesting and ironic that none of the artists talking today were actually born in America. So I wanted to know, like, how do I ask this? Your work reflects your personal background or your personal ideas. So was it challenging, or was it a culture shock to try to translate that into our American culture, or try to make us Americans comprehend or understand or even accept your views? Did that make sense?
I didn't even think about America. Like, I don't think about any culture. I don't think about any culture. I come from Egypt. I grew up in France, and I'm here. So for me, if I have to think about each time I move about like the culture I am with, I will not be able to. Just waiting for the culture to understand me, and it's difficult sometimes.
I have a friend who teaches at Overton High School. She says there's 51 languages in that high school now. So, what's American culture, So.
Well, I think it's a super interesting question, because I think personally there's a lot of the history of art is filled with kind of people who've moved around a lot, and artists tend to be people who are kind of curious and seeking that kind of cosmopolitanness. It's in their nature, and I also think it goes back to that question about grammars. it's kind of easier to see the flaws in a grammar from outside. Because you arrive as a stranger, you're like, well, a lot of this is pretty familiar, but people aren't talking about some of the stuff we talk about at home like it doesn't exist. And some of the stuff they talk about a lot that we at home don't think is very important. Like each culture has its own kind of sets of rules. But underneath that, there's very common rules which are harder to look at when you're embedded in them. Like, you know, the structure of who owns what, who is allowed to do what is the okay way to be. And I think that's very critical when you're thinking about being an artist, because there's not only this idea of the grammar of art and the art historical grammar, but also what is sort of correct for your moment. And sometimes what's correct for your moment is to break the grammar. But you only kind of know what that is. I think of someone like Kendrick Lamar, who, speaking of romantic, like To Pimp a Butterfly, you know, it's like the most romantic, sort of aspirational, but he's constantly breaking the structure of what you would consider to be a coherent sound space. Like he's masterfully like reorganizing your perceptions of time and who is in command of the discourse and the voices that you should be hearing. So I think that's kind of super important to this question of like, how do you know, like dislocation, this idea of the dislocation, or what Nelson Goodman, who's an art historian who talks about notation, calls syntactically disjointed, which is where you sort of, it's almost like imagine your joints being kind of put out of joint, but somehow you can now reach that cup in your bathroom that you could never reach before, like this. You know, it's like becoming double jointed, and it's not that you've broken your body, it goes back to this idea of reversion, but you've learned something new by putting yourself in a very different position. So I think it's a kind of a weird thing that artists should do and is really useful. But underneath, lots of the rules remain the same, but there are different opportunities for anyone's unique perspective. Like no one in England had the slightest interest in anything I said about anything artistically, and never would have. It's absolutely clear. And I've done a couple of shows there, and people are like, yep, still completely uninterested. Best review of my life was in London. It was like, these are the scribblings of a 5-year-old child. And I was like, yes, you know, my people. But I think that is kind of key, right? Like being an outsider in that sense of displaced in time and space. It's like, it's important. It does, and it's so true in the history of art.
Well, I think that's how all three of the artists up here, that's how their work works, is, and when we use the word works, it means it gets under your skin, is able to get under your skin, is by meshing 2 or 3 dissonant points of view. I mean, you've got kitsch, Disney imagery that gets recontextualized, or when I look at your paintings, I think of Persian miniatures up against Bosch, up against, you know, color fill painting. And if any one of them existed as a singular trope or device, it wouldn't work. But when they come together and they sort of contaminate each other, almost a virus against each other, it begins to work. And images out of a Disney coloring book doesn't work, but all of a sudden when it's multiplied and this sensuous color and string attached to it, and those kind of I read a book one time about metaphors, and metaphors work by multiple images colliding and colluding, and so I think that's a good description of what all of you guys do.
One thing I would say in response to the question of Americanness is there has emerged in the last couple of years, I think, in response to Trump, in response to a lot of these phenomena, a bit of a revived conversation about what American art is, you know. And when the Whitney reopened, they had this big show, America's Hard to Find, and they had a Grant Wood exhibition very recently, which raised these questions as well. And there's been kind of a conversation going on about what nationalism means in the current era. And I think one of the things that's, for me, quite compelling about this show is its distinctive kind of internationalism, which is something we haven't talked about, but that effort that's addressed in the catalog by Medea about cosmopolitanism and what this might mean, and how the contemporary conditions, in some sense, rather than falling into a kind of nationalism, may, in fact, form the conditions for a kind of shared experience or conversation. So, that's not a question.
Well, thank you all so much. We can continue this conversation in the galleries. Anything else to say?
Thank you all very much. Please do join us.
She's trying to get you to say something.
Sorry?
I think she's trying to get you to say something.
You want?
Please put in the surveys for us that are on the
Okay.
screen. So thank you all so much.
Did you all hear that?
Yes, please.
Surveys.
Please return your surveys at the back of the auditorium.